I planned on attending the annual Adelaide anime and video game convention dressed as a character that many people would be familiar with. I chose the character from the television series Monkey, which was a Japanese television series telling the story Journey to the West, written by Wu Cheng-en in the 16th century China. The costume that the actor Masaki Sakai wore to play the Monkey King was a red-coloured robe with a yellow neckerchief, a golden head circlet and a thick belt. He also brandished a black-coloured staff weapon.
First, I obtained a few pictures of the character from the internet. I tried to get the dimensions of each of the different parts of the costume by comparing the actor's height to my height and presuming that other parts of the costume might also scale. In particular, I was interested in the size of the staff. Because I had computer images of the costume and the staff, I measured the lengths in numbers of pixels in a picture viewing program and used Pythagoras' law to determine any diagonal lengths. These pixel lengths needed to be scaled to give full-size length in centimeters. So by considering the ratio of the length to the actor's height versus the ratio of the unknown staff length to my height, I obtained a length of a little under 2 meters. In some images, the staff is obviously not held within the two-dimensional plane projected from the camera to the actor's height, and consequently a parallax error is introduced, and the measurement will be inaccurate. I decided that 2 meters would be reasonable length for the staff. Next I decided that I would read a dressmaking book to determine what measurements would be needed to make the robe. Measurements for creating an upper body garment detailed in the book include front length, chest width, bust, shoulder, side length, back width, back length, waist, neck, outside sleeve length, inside sleeve length, upper arm, and wrist. I found that the imperial system, inches and fractions of inches, were easier to work with than the metric system for body measurements. A half a pattern for one half of the bodies is generated from some of these measurements drawn onto a flat piece of paper. The largest size of paper I have is A3, so if a design extends onto another piece of paper, I use sticky tape to attach it. Folds are made on the paper at a few points which will be replicated when produced on the fabric, called darts, which allow material to be held in position to allow for curves of the body. Because I do not have a womanly bosom and consequently a significantly larger bust than waist, these darts are not as important for constructing a fitted costume. I was interested in making a pattern that I could cut out from the fabric, so I studied the costume and discovered that one part of the fabric is folded over the other at the front, and that this would need to be considered. The design I came up with was a double the bodies pattern detailed in the book, extended down past the waist. When I constructed this with paper and wore it, a large fold of paper jutted out at the back. This may not have been replicated using fabric, but it was worrying enough for me to consider if this was the best possible pattern for constructing the costume. I searched the internet for Chinese clothing and found a pattern that would likely serve for the construction of a similar costume. I used my bust, side length, and neck measurements to develop this pattern. Then I made it from paper and wore it. The shoulders were still square, so I decided to try making it using an old bedsheet. I sewed it together and many different seams and produced a wearable garment which drooped at the shoulders. I was a little worried that the sleeves might not be as long on the outside as on the inside, but looking at the original image I find this to be the case anyhow. After having put the prototype costume together, I thought that altering the pattern may require less seams, so I made the pattern that only required 3 seams instead of the original 13. Considering the patterns on the garment, I drew a swirl pattern to be attached to the edges of the garment that looked like it had similar proportions to that in the original image. I scanned it into the computer, removed edges and copied it to attach to itself many times. The geometrical multi-crescent shape was constructed using a compass and a ruler. A useful way to divide a line in half or to create a perpendicular extension line is to swing the compass from both endpoints and drawing a line through the intersections of the circle arcs. I scanned this into the computer also, and after colouring the crescents, printed it out along with the swirls. I cut out most of the white space within the pattern, leaving small paper bridges holding the pattern in place. Then I used this pattern as a mask to draw the lines for the pattern onto the reverse side of fabric. The fabric I chose to use was called Panay Velvet, which appeared to be available in all the required colours. The material was approximately 1.5 meters wide. I brought 3 meters length of red, 1 meter of brown, and 1 meter of light brown. I also brought 1 meter length of yellow dance satin for the neckerchief. I also tried to find the appropriate colour of thread for the sewing machine, and when I could not, I substituted a colour which was close. The neckerchief was relatively easy to construct, and I sewed a zigzag pattern to bind the ends before folding over and sewing a straight stitch to create a smooth edge. The seams in the velvet were created by first sewing a straight stitch and then later sewing a zigzag through both pieces of material. It was difficult to create the edge strip displaying the swirl on the garment because seams would have to be sewn onto a jagged edge, and when I was creating the paper model, I was attempting to take into consideration how much material would be taken up by the seams, but think that may have become exaggerated somewhat. To make matters worse, the 1 meter length of material I bought was not large enough to accommodate the pattern that the paper model suggested, so I cut the pattern from smaller lengths of material, which created extra seams which were inappropriate for the final design. Before I sewed these strips, the pattern needed to be sewn onto the material, but the pattern I had cut curled up and did not easily uncurl. When I applied a zigzag pattern to the top line of the pattern, the material stretched, creating a wider pattern than I assumed it would take. It also took a long time to apply zigzag to each of the pieces of the pattern. To save some time, fabric glue was used to stick down some of the central parts of the pattern.
I did not have time to create the full costume, and the robe was the only thing that I had time to make, and it was made badly. Parts of the edge strip were attached in the wrong place. Had I more time, I would have made the large belt which holds the robe on, monkey staff, and golden circlet worn on his head. Some ideas I canvassed for the costume also included the idea of a small cloud that could be called by monkey and ridden at will. This would have been achieved by applying a mass of cotton wool to the feet. Despite the costume being unfinished, when I attended the convention, a few people recognized what character I was attempting to emulate.